Today, I wanted to give myself enough time to properly respond to Natasha from LA, who left a very eloquent voicemail that was played on the previous episode. So today, I'm just going to play segments and respond to them as we go. It'll be a nice conversation, and hopefully we can clear some things up. At least understand where we're all coming from. Whether we agree at the end or not is another question. So let's get started. Ridden from New York City to Princeton.
Natasha from LA.
The first night of Climate Ride, we actually spent the night at Princeton University, which is kind of cool. It's a relatively short day, only about 45 miles of riding that day. The next 4 days will be getting from there all the way down to DC, and that's why there won't be an episode coming up in 3 days as normal. It'll have to be another 3 days after that once I'm back home. So I'll just go ahead and jump in here and lay some foundation for the discussion, because a lot of what's going to be said is about making a distinction between fundamental and subsequent arguments. And as Natasha just pointed out, I think maybe the fundamental argument is, yeah, the government really just shouldn't be telling people whether or not they're allowed to use marijuana, because it's been shown to be no more dangerous than alcohol. And so if we all essentially agree as a society that it doesn't make sense to try to outlaw alcohol, then it really doesn't make sense to outlaw marijuana. All other arguments essentially flow from there.
For starters, I'm against drug use in general. I can understand people having fun every once in a while, but I've seen the devastation that drugs can cause. And because of that, it bewilders me that we'd consider making them more available. I
am also against drug use. Not only do I not use drugs myself, I don't even drink alcohol. So, I don't have a personal stake in this whatsoever. And I've absolutely seen people ruin their lives with alcohol. But now we're talking about the best way to deal with it. And so there doesn't need to be a disagreement on that front, deciding that something needs to be done. We just need to figure out the best way to do it. I don't think, and I think the evidence shows that outlawing it is not the best route to solving the problem for people. I would much rather turn people with addictions to either alcohol or drugs into patients rather than inmates.
Whether or not you agree with this, I think everyone can understand the concerns the government would have when it comes to having a society in which drugs are widespread, which is why everyone agrees that there should be anti-drug education programs.
So this statement carries with it the assumption that the war on drugs is reducing the supply of drugs available to people who want to take those drugs. I don't think there's actually any evidence for that. I think the only effect really being had is the price of drugs is higher than it would normally be, but the availability seems to be there for anyone who wants to partake as it is.
So if we take it as a given that the war on drugs is bad because people get killed as a result of it, the solution isn't to stop the war on drugs, which will only solve one problem, but to stop the demand for drugs. If people wouldn't do drugs and would find a healthy way of dealing with what ails them psychologically as they would for what ails them physically, there would be no need for a war on drugs. Stopping the war on drugs because of problems in the supply chain isn't going to the source of the problem.
I can agree with everything in this statement in theory, but I don't think it's realistic. You can look back at history and you can see that people have been eating or smoking or licking anything they can get their hands on to alter their state of mind for millennia. It's just part of who we are. Drugs aren't just for people who are sad and depressed and need an escape. They're for perfectly happy, well-adjusted people who want to have some extra fun. It's just part of who we are. Ask any 4-year-old why they like to spin around in a circle. Makes them feel funny, makes the world spin around, and it's fun. That doesn't mean it's for everyone. Like I said, I don't do drugs, but to imagine that we could reduce the demand for drugs down to zero or anywhere close to zero is a completely fanciful notion. Now, on top of that, I think that the war on drugs, the way it is currently constructed, does more harm than good. So, I used an analogy recently about gun control legislation. I said the gun control legislation is like Advil when what you need is antibiotics. And so we need to deal with more structural societal problems. And this is what Natasha's referring to. However, the analogy for this, I think, is a little different. Now, let's, for the sake of argument, we'll say that drugs are entirely bad, just for the sake of argument. So if doing drugs is entirely bad, like as if you're cutting your own arm, you can't help it, you want to do it for some reason, but it's bad, you're cutting your arm, you're opening these big wounds, well, then the war on drugs as it stands is just coming in and sprinkling a little salt in those wounds. And so you can say, hey, it's not the war on drugs isn't the problem. What you need to do is stop cutting yourself. Okay, understood. Let's work on that. But in the meantime, let's not keep sprinkling that salt.
Similarly, the recent podcast looked at drugs from the angle of race. I understand very well that if you're black, you're more likely to get locked away for drug use or for other things, even though the rates of drug usage are about the same within the white and black communities. What I don't get is the leap that was implied in your show that if we legalize drugs, this will eliminate the problem. Legalizing drugs won't stop racism within law enforcement. That's another issue entirely, and one that needs to be solved, not by making all things for which black people might get arrested legal.
100% agreement on the logic used in that statement. However, I don't think that's the logic that any legalization advocates are using. This is another example of the difference between fundamental and subsequent arguments. The fact that people of color are arrested at higher rates for drug use is not a fundamental reason to legalize drugs. It's a subsequent reason. It's evidence of the damage the war on drugs does to communities that are already oppressed in other ways. The fact that the drug war is implemented in racist ways and devastates communities of color needs to be put on the scale on the side of decriminalization, not because it's the fundamental reason, but because it is one of the negative effects to society that needs to be judged as part of the, pro-con chart on whether or not we keep the drugs illegal or change the law.
The parallel about the legalization of drugs and gun control from the call on the most recent, or from Jay's commentary on the most recent podcast proves my point even more. We don't want things around us that are dangerous for ourselves and for others, whether the danger is direct, as in to the user of drugs, or to one who commits suicide, or indirect, as in those caught in crossfire or killed in car accidents with drug users. The difference between drugs and guns is that guns are immediately effective, whereas the cumulative effects of a life on drugs takes time to kill somebody, drawing out the grief of those around him or her. One proposed solution to the problem of guns in this country is to make mental health care more available. It's a good idea, especially when used as part of a plan and not the only solution. Why can't we take the same approach to drugs? Rather than allowing members of society to hide from their problems, and let's face it, the majority of Americans don't have problems like those mentioned that exist in Afghanistan, why don't we offer solutions that promote well-being? As Jay said at the end of the most recent podcast, we need to address the root of the problem, and in this case, it would be with a society that is set up to help people. Thanks, Jay. Keep up the good work.
So my final thoughts on this can be to agree with that sentiment entirely, that what we need is to set up society to help people. And I think that all of the evidence over the last 50 years has shown that the war on drugs hurts and criminalizes people at the exact moment when they may need help the most, or when they're not doing anything bad at all. I mean, there's a couple of kinds of drug users: those who don't need help because they're perfectly under control and not hurting anyone, and those who actually do need help because maybe they have an addiction problem, in which case we should help those people rather than criminalize them. So I think that even if all other things were equal, the best route would be to decriminalize drugs and put all of the resources that we put into the drug war instead into anti-drug campaigns, awareness campaigns, and addiction clinics, and actual resources people could use for free to get themselves off of drugs if they want to. However, not all other things are equal. Not only do I think that the drug war is going in the wrong direction in terms of helping people, as we all want to do, but it actually hurts lots of other people at the same time. So there's the way the drug war is implemented in a racist way, and so that hurts communities of color. But then it also creates an artificially high cost for drugs, which stimulates criminal activity that spans all the way from the big drug cartels that are basically running Mexico, all the way to the localized gang violence that has to do with selling drugs at the so-called retail market, essentially. So the war on drugs hurts people. It hurts the actual individuals who use drugs rather than helping them. It hurts their families. It hurts communities. And then it empowers violent criminals, like cartels and local drug gangs, essentially all because Nixon got it in his head that he didn't like marijuana and wanted to outlaw it, even though the commission that he set up to investigate it came back and said that it's not a dangerous drug. So again, what I think it comes back to is that the government has the burden of proof to make the argument for why it's legitimate to keep it illegal rather than having the burden of proof on people like me to prove that it should be legalized, even though I think the proof is completely on my side and self-evident anyways.